Hey everybody, CyberTab back with you again. We're continuing our finalization of looking at how to fight against hanging pawns. Today we're choosing a game from my personal favorite world champion, Tigran Petrosian. If you're looking to improve your positional play, it is very difficult to go wrong with the games of Petrosian, especially if you love exchange sacrifices like I do. But here is White against Petrosian-Hort. This is a game I played in 1972. Knight f3 is sort of a crafty positional move that's perfectly suited to Tigran Petrosian's crafty positional ways. And then b3. This was a favorite hobby horse of Petrosian, more or less invented by Nimzovich back in the 1920s. A lot of his correspondence wars about chess focused on this opening, along with a few others. Basically, the Queen's Indian from the white side. Not the best opening for white, but if you're looking to get away from theory, something like this, it's perfectly sound. It's funny to think about back in the 1920s, something like this would have been considered controversial and wild and a crazy way to play chess. Now it's considered sort of a boring positional way of playing. It's just completely accepted. There's no longer such a thing as hypermodern or non-hypermodern. There's just good chess and bad chess. And hypermodern ways have just become part and parcel of playing good chess. Just depends on the situation and the taste. d5. e3. This is an important opening nuance. Petrosian played Fischer in 1971 in a game where he committed his bishop to b2 too early, and Fischer chose the correct move of f6. This punishes White's bishop for committing to b2 too early. Black is simply going to get e5 in, and then this bishop on b2 just doesn't make sense anymore. So e3 keeps the bishop in stasis and waits for Black to show more of his hand. So knight f6, now that pawn can't come to f6, bishop b2 is completely correct, and beautifully placed, it helps fight for this key e5 square. e6, this is good play from Hort. Nice e6, bishop e5, this wouldn't necessarily be bad for Black, but this is exactly what White wants. This is exactly a Nimzo Indian, just a useful tempo up. I wouldn't necessarily say White is even better just yet, but this just gives White clear play. This is exactly the sort of thing that White is looking for when he plays a b3 opening. e6 keeps that knight hanging back, so Petrosian played c4, which is my personal preference here. Bishop e5 just isn't as effective yet, because there's not that knight in c6 to pin. Bishop d7 would be probably Black's best response here. One way of playing a4, this would be sort of a BOGO Indian way of playing. But Black is fine here. This bishop on b5 doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's sort of developed for the sake of developing. And then Black can continue with maybe knight c6 later, or you can just play a6 and kick that bishop away. Or b6 and then a6 first so he doesn't get his pawns frozen. But Black is perfectly fine here. d4 would be another way of playing. And this is the Zucker-Tort. So the Kali-Zucker-Tort, this sort of scheme of openings can be reached from a variety of move orders. It was sort of weird to look at the database. Theoretically, Black is fine here. I mean, this is well established that Black has very clear paths to equality. But White scores incredibly well here. White scores well over 60% from some of these lines. I would say it's probably due to the ease of White's plans. White has a very easy plan. He's just going to play knight bd2, knight e5, f4 in some situations, and then just go for a kingside attack. Black does need to know some theory to equalize here. It's not easy. Black's play isn't nearly as clear-cut. I think practically that shows the benefit of playing aggressive chess. It's always easier to attack than defend, and if you choose an attacking repertoire that puts pressure on your opponent, you're almost always going to see the benefits of that. But small diversion there. Petrosian played c4 here, which I completely agree with. It's sort of the Englishy way of playing. 6. Bishop e2. So this is a little bit surprising. But Petrosian, of course, was known for his sort of crafty, sideways positional play, which seemed passive in some respects. Bishop e5 would be the most natural move, in my opinion. Just, now that the knight's committed itself to c6. e4, castle. And this is a dynamic isolated queen pawn for black. Black is well placed here. This will be a good fight to come. Notice that there's not a good way for white to take that pawn. Here, black has a decisive attack. Taking on c6 with the bishop doesn't really work either. And this is overwhelming compensation for the pawn. This bishop on a6 single-handedly stops white from castling. Black has the bishop pair in general. Good attacking chances. This is far more than enough for the pawn. So white should probably just castle here. But this is a legitimately nice isolated queen pawn for black. This is just going to be a dynamic fight. That's pretty well balanced. So bishop a2, perhaps Petrosian is looking to dodge some of his more aggressive isolated queen pawns for black. It does come at a risk. Bishop e7, this is too passive. Black can very easily play more aggressively. d4, in my opinion, is completely correct here. You often see in playing against these fee and shadow openings that if you can achieve an aggressive blunting of that bishop, it's often correct, because you want to try to prove that this bishop is prematurely placed on that square. So I give some opening theory. Of course, I don't want to turn hanging pawn discussion into a big opening symposium, but the main line I give in my analysis. This is more or less a forced sequence from here. And black is 2 pawns down, but he has humongous compensation. White would be prudent to take the perpetual check on offer here. But sort of long and short, d4 is definitely the move you want to make work, because it's aggressive. It's seeking out central space, blunting this bishop on b2. Bishop e7, not only is it passive, but it's misplacing the bishop for an isolated queen pawn structure. So here, Petrosian castles, which is definitely not accurate. d4 would be the most accurate here, because black has committed himself to playing bishop e7. That bishop is misplaced for an isolated queen pawn. Black absolutely wants that bishop to be on d6 for an isolated queen pawn structure. So if we go into an isolated queen pawn structure now, we'll have an extra tempo because we're white, and then we'll have another extra tempo because black has to move that bishop again to get it to its optimal place. So the line I give, castle, that's sort of an idealized position for white. White's definitely slightly better here, because that small detail of the bishop not being on d6 means that black is going to lose even more time down the line. I give a couple other lines here. Bishop b4 is also another way of playing. But this is fairly directly refuted. You can look at this line in the game notes. I'll have that in the comments as usual. Petrosian played castles. It's not bad, but d4 was the most assertive move. Castle, d4 is still possible here. It's not as good. And this isn't... both of these lines, both h3 and bishop xd4, are pawn sacrifices. Not nearly as clear. So d4, it's still possible, but it's not nearly as clear. So Hort's decision to play castles is definitely understandable. But after d4, this is a favorable isolated queen pawn structure for white, or ends up being a hanging pawn structure. Again, that small detail of the bishop being on e7 instead of d6 is, in my opinion, all the difference, because that's going to... First, we're up a tempo because we're white, compared to the usual structures where the colors are reversed. And that small detail of having to lose another tempo to get that bishop to its optimal post. These positions often hang on aggressive tempo play. And whenever you have to spend time moving your pieces a second time like that, that represents something crucial in many instances. So here, I don't want to overstate it. Black still has some chances here, but this is definitely a solid advantage for white. Bishop g4, this is definitely wrong. This bishop is just going to be losing time out in the wilderness. Taking on d4 is correct. And then bishop d6. Black just bites the bullet and gets the tempo loss out of the way. One potential line. And white's definitely for choice here. I would definitely say white is slightly better. But again, because black has his pieces in optimal places, even if it took some extra time, black has some attacking chances here. Bishop g4 just puts that bishop out there doing nothing. That's not where the bishop belongs in these sorts of dynamics. Knight c3, rook c1, so threatening that bishop on c5, so black loses even more time. Knight d4, so this sort of exposes the bishop on g4 as a loss of time. When you have the isolated pawn, you don't want to be liquidating minor pieces. Of course, knight d4 sort of forces that at least one set to come off. Another way of playing h3 is also fine. This is a different way of playing. White keeps the minor pieces on the board in hopes of his own aggressive play. He can shift his knight to f4 and try for kingside pressure of his own, or just using those minor pieces to pressure the isolated pawn. Knight d4 is definitely more keeping in Petrosian's style, and it's definitely classically more what you want to do against the isolated pawn. You want to trade minor pieces off the board and head for a superior position where you can pressure those pawn weaknesses. Knight c2, knight f4. So just like the previous game that we looked at, the ability to maneuver your knights into optimal places is often what makes the difference in these isolated pawn and hanging pawn structures. The spots for your bishops are often going to be very clear. So this bishop on b2, that's done and dusted. That's baked in. That's the perfect spot for that bishop. It's finding the perfect outpost for our knights that is going to make or break this position. And here on f4, this knight is perfectly placed. It's pressuring the isolated pawn, and it's also helping to pressure the kingside in conjunction with this incredibly strong bishop on b2. It's often a feature of these positions that white will get a kingside attack out of nowhere, almost solely based on the strength of this bishop on b2. And we see a little bit of it in this game as well. Grab d8. Knight e4, so that's where the bishop, that's where the knight belongs. So excellent move from black. Knight c6. So I actually chose a game to look at where the transition to hanging pawns isn't ideal from white. When I was being trained at a younger age, I hated looking at idealized games because so often you're not going to see the idealized version in your own games. You're going to get the messy version where things are close. Here, the transition to hanging pawns, in my opinion, isn't correct. It's understandable, but it's not correct. In my opinion, this is a favorable enough isolated pawn structure for white that it profits white to keep the isolated pawn on the board. Especially this knight on f4. It's directly pressuring that isolated pawn on d5. So I would rather continue that pressure against the pawn on d5 than reinforcing that pawn by trading on c6. One potential way of playing bishop d6. Black has to let the pawn go here, more or less. If black plays something like b6, again, we see the strength of that knight on f4. That knight on f4 is just beautifully placed. And it's another reason why you wouldn't want to trade on c6 to reinforce that pawn on d5. But one potential line here. And white has a very solid advantage. Black still has this weakness on d5. There's a weak pawn on b7 as well. The bishop versus the knight, when you have an open board like this with pawns on both sides of the board, the bishop is nearly always the better piece, just because it's a long-range piece. It can hit both sides of the board at once, whereas the knight's more of a short-range piece that will typically get outrun by the bishop on an open board like this. So I don't want to overstate white's advantage. Black still has good drawing chances here, and some active possibilities of his own, but this is definitely an advantage for white. Whereas taking on c6, it sort of nullifies the strength of this knight on f4. That knight hitting the pawn on d5 no longer matters because black has that pawn on c6 guarding it. The knight still has some strength because it can conjoin with the bishop on b2 to pressure that king side. So the knight is still strong, but having traded on c6 sort of nullifies some of its strength. Rook c2, rook fd1, a little bit better in my opinion. Just small detail. Bishop f8, proactively guarding the square in g7 against the bishop on b2. That's excellent. 1, queen b7. Queen e2. Another way of playing this, f3 is a common choice in the structure. Basically, white embraces having this slightly tender pawn on e3 now to take away this vital square from black. One way of proceeding from here. And white has a solid edge. Black has his own counterplay. This pawn in f3 is a little bit tender. If black doesn't want to play g6, he can play rook e8 here. But this sort of allows white to display the point of his piece reorganization. And I think white's position it looks better than it actually is, because the blockade of the hanging pawns, it doesn't actually attack the hanging pawns. The point of a weakness is to attack and win it, not just blockade it. So these pieces look nice, but it's a little bit harder to make progress than the position actually shows. White's position looks pretty, but it looks better than it actually is. But white is certainly for choice here. All of white's pieces are better than the black counterparts. So queen e2, not necessarily worse, just f3 is a different way of playing. Rook e8. So this is a routine move that completely overlooks white's aggressive possibilities. a5. When you have hanging pawns, always keep in mind this a-pawn break is a resource to activate. So here, black can't really get the kingside counterplay that you associate with having hanging pawns. So that a-pawn break is sort of a backup way of gaining activity. Queen g4, c5. When you have hanging pawns, they are mobile and they can gain space. As before. This is just one example line, but I found this way of playing for black attractive. This is sort of a long quasi-forced line. And this liquidates down to a dead draw. Now, there are some alternatives, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds. But I love the thematic nature of this sequence from black. Again, you always want to have this a-pawn break in the back of your mind when playing with hanging pawns. And again, having hanging pawns, you always want to remember that they're mobile. And that d4 break is almost always so thematic in these positions. So rook e8, it's just a routine move, and it's playing passively in a situation where black needs to be looking for his own counterplay. Whether you're defending or attacking, always be on the lookout for active play. Don't just shuffle your pieces. You need to figure out, what's my plan, what's my pawn break, and how am I going to achieve this? Rook e8 does none of those. Queen g4. So I mentioned before that sometimes with this bishop in b2, white can sometimes just randomly get a decisive attack out of nowhere. And this is one of those situations where suddenly the bishop in b2, the queen in g4, the knight on f4, suddenly it looked like white's position was sort of optimized to pressure these hanging pawns. All of a sudden, it's clear that white's going for a kingside attack. g6, this is just a decisive error. c5, it prevents any tactical nonsense. And this does hold for black. h4, I like this line, just sending that h-pawn up the board to coordinate with these attacking pieces. f3, this is one potential line. This is a good solid advantage for white. These hanging pawns are definitely going to be under pressure. All of white's pieces are better than their black counterparts, but this isn't nearly decisive for white at all. Black still has good defensive chances here. g6 just turns this bishop into an absolute monster and overlooks white's tactical blow. Queen d1. Tigran Petrosian has a reputation as sort of a boring positional player, but he was also one of the best tacticians of all time. And it was because he was a great tactician that he was able to snuff out someone's activity 10 moves before it even happened. So his passive positional play shouldn't be mistaken for not having tactical chops. He was one of the best tactical players of all time. He just used his calculation ability in a different way. He was sort of the Negaduck version of Mikhail Tal. So it's hard to say why he overlooked knight x d5. So the point is, on that, wins. Now, it might have been either in this position or this position, he thought that f5 was just winning for black. But if you take a little bit further, the pawn takes, and that's checkmate for white. And if black pins, just queen d4, and then queen h8 is coming later with a just crushing position. Pawn up with a mating attack. So it's hard. I mean, queen d1 doesn't completely dissipate white's advantage, but it's hard to say why Petrosian missed that direct win because he was such a great calculator. Everyone's got an off day. Bishop d6, this allows the tactics to maintain in place. Bishop g7 is necessary to diffuse this bishop on b2. Knight d3. And this is a big advantage for white. So all of these pawns are on light squares, so black's dark squares are completely emaciated. After f3, this knight's going to hop into c5. But black is still holding. Black has not lost yet. White's going to still need to find the moves. But bishop d6 just collapses. Knight x d5, very simple tactic. Petrosian finally sees it. Rook c d8 was played if the pawn takes. Queen d4, so if king f8, white skewers the queen, so f6 is forced. Queen x e4, and white's 2 pawns up. This is resignable. So rook c d8 was played, but then rook x c6. f4, and then queen d4. And Hort resigned here. There's the long diagonal is a river of doom for black. So the key to the position. And this is sort of a hybrid, which is why I wanted to show it, because it has some issues with isolated pawns as well. But to reiterate, these maneuvers of your knights in both isolated pawns and hanging pawns are so key. Because so often against hanging pawns and isolated pawns, the squares for your bishop are going to be completely clear. So here, white's bishop is on b2. That's done. We know that bishop is absolutely perfect there. It's the knights in this position that white can optimize. And it's finding an effective route for a knight, which is often difficult for improving players. So here, Petrosian immediately recognizes that this square on f4 is absolutely perfect. It's pressuring the isolated pawn, and it's hovering over the kingside, where it can do some good work in conjunction with the bishop on b2. Now, in this specific position, transition to hanging pawns wasn't correct. But it is thematic the way Petrosian suddenly maneuvered for this kingside attack out of nowhere. When you're facing the hanging pawns, and this is something I wanted to get out of this game, don't be locked into thinking that attacking the hanging pawns are your only asset. Especially in conjunction with a bishop like this, you can often get a kingside attack out of nowhere. And suddenly this knight on f4, this bishop on b2, this queen on g4, they're all hovering over this black kingside, and because all of black's pieces, or most of black's pieces, are committed to helping out with the hanging pawns, suddenly that's an outnumbered kingside. And even with best play, white's able to get some good concessions out of attacking the kingside. And this would be an optimal endgame for whites. White can go forward with pressuring the hanging pawns and basically maneuver forever. But as the game went, Petrosian should have gotten this position. This would have been just a completely winning attack. But excellent game from Petrosian. Good example of how facing hanging pawns, you're not just locked into attacking the hanging pawns. You can play against the enemy king just as effectively as any other type of position. So we're going to continue our roundup tomorrow with another example. My name is John. I'll see you then.